Hello and welcome. Okay, in this little episode, I want to talk about Plato's text Lysis, commonly known as the text which asks the question, "What is friendship?" A lot of this dialogue basically asks kind of simple questions about compatibility, social compatibility. Are people who are distinct drawn together? Are people who are similar drawn together? And it's a short text, and it just goes through a lot of these sorts of different inquiries. Most of them end with nothing useful. Most of the time, we ask the question, basically, do opposites attract? Do things that are similar to each other attract? And it seems they do, but then they don't. And the usual confusion and swings and roundabouts of a Platonic dialogue occur. But there is one part that I think could touch on what Plato is trying to posit here as the true sort of function or true nature of friendship. And it is what we could call a sort of immunological understanding of social relations, sort of reflexive of a kind of metaphysics of tension between good and evil that exist inside an individual soul. So the reason I claim it's immunological is because the sort of structure of this argument goes as such. I'll just read it out. So we come across in this section, we move from the kind of social question of compatibility. Are people that are similar compatible? Are people that are distinct compatible? And we move more into the metaphysics. So we have three categories basically being posited here by Plato, which is things which are good, things which are evil, and things which are neutral. And the example we get is a medical example. So sickness is evil, medicine is good, and the human body is neither good nor evil. So the body is neutral in this kind of cosmic metaphysical tension between good and evil. So the body encounters the need for the good when it encounters evil. So I'll just read from this section. He says, "But the human body regarded as a body is neither good nor evil." True. And the body is compelled by reason of disease to court and make friends of the art of medicine. Yes. Then what? Then that which is neither good nor evil becomes the friend of good by reason of the presence of evil. So we can infer. So in this manner, Socrates posits a sort of immunological understanding of the good, that the good isn't necessarily there until evil emerges, and then it responds to evil, like an immune system responds to a sickness or a virus. And in this sense, we can sort of create a sort of opening to analyze a wider sort of spectrum of Plato's texts and arguments and his project, his educational project, and his understanding of how ethics and the metaphysics of the psyche and the soul play out in the kind of more concrete social context. But before I get into that, I want to just go through another little part of this text just to highlight the metaphysical, immunological argument Plato's making here. So we have this question of good and evil and that which is neutral. And the body, for example, is is neutral, and sickness can be seen as an evil, and medicine could be seen as a good, or health, you could say in general, could be seen as a good. So it's probably safe to say that at any given time, most people are not completely sick or completely healthy. They're somewhat, to some degree, in a spectrum between 1 and 100, we could say. Some people are like 90% healthy, but they've got a little bit of health problems here and there. Some people are 50%. Some people that are, dying on their deathbed are 10% healthy. So there's a spectrum. And therefore, the human psyche, I think, for Plato is not, and the kind of metaphysics of good and evil is not completely absolute. Like, it's not that someone is either purely good or purely evil. There is a sort of spectrum, which is different for different people. So then we have this question of how do these substances, if we look at good and evil as sort of kind of active substances, which I think here Plato is basically saying exist in the psyche, but perhaps even in some sense in the body, given that his examples are all quite bodily examples. They're often to do with medicine and sickness. But yeah, I'll just read this section, and we can think about how these two substances interact with each other, good and evil. Okay, I'll read from here. Further, I must observe that substances are assimilated when others are present with them, and there are some which are not assimilated. Take, for example, the case of an ointment or color which is put on another substance. In such a case, it is the substance which is anointed the same. Is the substance which is anointed the same as the color or ointment? What do you mean? He said. This is what I mean. Suppose that I were to cover your auburn locks with white lead. Would they be really white, or would they only appear to be white? They would only appear to be white. And yet whiteness would be present in them, true. But that would not make them at all more white, notwithstanding the presence of white in them. They would not be white any more than black, no. But when old age infuses whiteness into them, then they become assimilated, and are white by the presence of white, certainly. Now I want to know whether in all cases a substance is assimilated by the presence of another, or must the presence be a peculiar source? The latter, he said. Then that which is neither good nor evil may be in the presence of evil, but not yet evil. So, okay. So basically, I think what Socrates is getting at here is basically the kind of blurry ground between good and evil. This isn't an argument for like a total moral ambiguity, like there's no such thing as good and evil, these are two absolute. I think he is saying that there's a point where one of these things can't be absolute, but like most people probably live, if we're talking about these forces of good and evil being represented as something which exists within our psyche and within the human body even, most people probably live in a state where there is a kind of tension between these two forces to some degree or another. That we can have the presence of evil while still not having that evil completely take over. So basically, how do we stop evil from completely taking over? Well, how does the body stop sickness? How can the body have a virus or in some sense be affected by illness or sickness and not let that completely take over? Well, it's an immune system. So it's a kind of immunological argumentation. Okay, so now I want to get more into the social relations, which I believe Plato is sort of positing in some of his other texts. And I'm going to particularly here point to Plato's chapter on the tyrant in the Republic, because I think there's room to make an argument if we're thinking in this immunological context. that people exist within a certain tension of good and evil, and the good is a response to the presence of evil. That you could say, well, what's an example of a living person whose soul, we could say, is completely corroded by evil, who doesn't have any immune system? Well, it's the tyrant. The tyrant is often posited by Plato not just as like a person who has power in some concrete sense, but as a person who is 700 times more unhappy than your average person, for example, or who is existing at the very bottom of some sort of spiritual hierarchy, of which the philosopher is on the top. And you go down and you have the soldier and you have the tradesman and you have the musician or whatever. And you get further and further and further down, and eventually you have the tyrant. He's at the bottom of a spiritual hierarchy. So I want to posit the idea that the tyrant is a kind of immunological deficiency in Plato's terms. So if we switch now to the Republic and read the section on the tyrant, we can see a somewhat similar structure. So the tyrant is described here as a influential young man, potentially someone who's going to have power in the future, like a prince, or the son of a wealthy, influential man, or the son of a king, or something like this. And he has like a lot of negative influences around him, basically, to put it in simple terms. Let me just read the section. It says, suppose further that the same thing happens to the son as to the father. He's drawn towards complete license, which his tempters call liberty. His father and family support moderation, but his tempters come in on the other side. And when the wicked wizards who want to make him a tyrant despair of keeping their hold on the young man by other means, they contrive to implant a master passion in him to control the idle desires and divide his time between them, like a great winged drone, unless you can think of a better description for such a passion. Note that describes it very well. The other desires buzz around, loading it with incense and perfume, flowers and wine, and all the pleasures of a dissolute life, of which they feed and fatten it until at last they produce in it the sting of mania. Then the master passion runs wild and takes madness into its service. Any opinions or desires with a decent reputation and any feelings of shame still left are killed or thrown out until all discipline is swept away. A madness usurps its place. End quote. So that is a sort of description of basically a young influential man who's got negative influences around them, and these negative influences are constantly kind of encouraging him in the wrong way, and indulging him, I would say, probably in certain ways. And they're likely doing this also because they feel like that if they can control this person's character, that might be a route for them to have more wealth or have more influence or power or something like this. Kind of Game of Thronesy situation we're talking about here. Kind of young, naive, perhaps naive ruler with a flawed character, and you've got these people who are lurking around him and influencing him and indulging him. I think of Joffrey here from Game of Thrones sometimes, like Joffrey, and the way like Tywin and Littlefinger and all these other influences are kind of circling around him, and they're sort of almost deliberately raising him to have this terrible, awful character because it sort of works for them. They can sort of bribe him easier. They can sort of annoy him easier. This sort of a kind of undisciplined, selfish, childish character is more controllable. Even though in some sense it's more tyrannical, it's also more controllable for the influences around them. And we also know that Plato did for a time live in Syracuse, and he did have something to do with, I think, one of the members of the dynasty there. I think a young man who was going to rule, or was already the king, or was going to be the king once his father died, or something like this. I think his name was Dion of Syracuse. And I think Plato was trying to, I think he was going over to Syracuse on occasion to try and influence this young aristocrat. And clearly it didn't go very well. So, Plato, I would imagine quite concretely that Plato had some first-hand experience dealing with the influence of younger men. It's also suspected that Plato was a gymnasiarch, I think it's called, which basically means you run a gym. And and he is, if he was a gymnasiarch, he means he's got experience teaching young men, and in his academy, perhaps teaching them wrestling or something like this. And he's constantly observing the influence on their character, and I think this really comes out in these dialogues. The and I think this is why, for example, you have this structure of the presence of evil, but not yet totally evil, because we know from psychology, modern psychology, that the developmental process of a human is very important. It's a whole different thing, to try and help a person when they're very young, or to try to help a person when they're very old or middle age or something like this. It's often the case that if a person is not helped by a certain time, it's more difficult to help them, right? They're kind of more stuck in their ways, so to speak, or the developmental process has sort of fixed certain tendencies or characteristics within that person stronger than if you had changed their environment, for example, when they were young. And if you did that when they were young, they'd probably, the sort of pathologies would probably be less fixed in them, fixed in their kind of subjectivity, we could even say, right? Obviously, this is something that Plato very likely picked up on himself. So in that sense, the uh, the presence of the good, if we go back to our kind of metaphysical immunological argument, the presence of the good in response to the presence of evil is something which also we could abstract to the concrete social relations of social influence over people. That in some sense, a lot of these young men in these dialogues are, whether it's Lysis or Alcibiades or Charmides, they're attracted to Plato, to Socrates, sorry, because they're kind of missing something. They're missing something in their soul. They're missing something in their personal social relations as well. And in this sense, Socrates resembles a sort of immune response to perhaps some of the more negative and degenerate influences that are surrounding that person. So, for example, Alcibiades is a very good dialogue to read in this context. Alcibiades is extremely young, ambitious, talented man who has a lot of people in the Athenian society sort of flattering him and trying to get his favor and following him around and probably sort of indulging him in some ways and influencing him in some ways, which are affecting the development of Alcibiades' character. And Socrates is normally someone who, in Plato's dialogues, is sought out by these young men. Socrates doesn't intrude into their lives and tell them what to do like some sort of overbearing father figure or something, right? Socrates he just lingers around in the society having conversations with people, and a lot of these young men, at least the better ones, will just be drawn towards him for reasons that they don't really understand why. And I think that this is could perhaps read in light of an immune response. And if we're talking about the nature of friendship in the text Lysis, we're talking about um, uh, the kind of metaphysics of the good emerging as a response to the presence of evil, but we're also talking about like the philosopher emerging in a society, or as an expression of friendship, um, in response to the kind of negative influence of other friendships, other relationships. For example, the people that are flattering Alcibiades just because they want to use him as a route to more power and prestige or wealth or something like this. People that are kind of parasitical, basically, um, and are negatively influencing the development of these young Greek men in a short-sighted, unethical, and somewhat parasitical, selfish manner. So the philosopher emerges in that situation as a sort of immune response to that negative influence, and these young men end up seeking out a wiser, older man to sort of, I suppose, retaliate and respond against that negative influence. So therefore, the the um, metaphysical structure of the good emerging in response to evil is sort of reflexive of the social and historical phenomena of the philosopher emerging in response to kind of negative social influences. Friendship, in the true sense of the word, in the sort of philosophical sense of the word, I suppose we could say, for Plato, is an immune response to those negative influences.